speaker, John Fegyveresi from Penn State. Welcome. John has a lot of different research interests, ice core, paleoclimatology, ice sheet dynamics, polar GPS. Yeah, he's been to Antarctica 5 times already in his brief career.
Yeah, still a student.
Yeah. And he also, in addition to doing interesting science, he's done outreach. So he's blogged about his field experiences for students from elementary to high school age. So very happy to have you.
Right.
Welcome.
Thank you all for coming. Anytime I get a chance where I can talk about what it is that I do, I get excited. So I'm glad that you came to hear a little bit about what I've done in the last couple of years in Antarctica. I hope the slides aren't too glared. I'll try to. I do have a lot of white slides. So, all right. So the title of my talk is 2 Miles of Climate History: How we Drilled the Deepest Ice Core in West Antarctica and Why. And so the last 5 years of my grad school, I've been involved with a very specific project where we drilled what has now become the deepest ice core ever drilled by the U.S. program in a very small remote camp in West Antarctica. This is just a picture of our camp in the sky. And I'll talk a little bit more about the camp later in the talk, but you can kind of just see that's the skiway where our plane landed. These are the buildings that we lived and worked in. We had a galley, we had a science tent, we had a medical tent. These tents down here are actual tents that we slept in. We actually slept right on the ice sheet. And off on the very far side over there, just at the edge, is the actual building where we drilled the core. So it was about a quarter of a mile drive on a skiddy ground to the arch. So, all right, I guess I'll just get into it. What exactly is it that I do? This is always an interesting way to start a talk. People know that I do something in Antarctica, I look at ice cores. What is it that I do? Well, I go and I play in Antarctica, basically. That's what I do. I go sledding, I goof around. Not really. I do have some fun in Antarctica. It's actually quite a blast being down there. But what I actually do as part of my graduate studies is I measure and I analyze a very specific ice core, and I take very specific measurements. And I can't really see these pictures all that well, but these are just pictures from various places in the field and in the lab. This is one of the ice cores. I'm looking at it. I'm taking some samples from it. I'm actually cutting a piece of the ice core there to measure gas samples. So these are just various things that I do. But to be even more specific, what I actually do as part of my research for my thesis, for my actual doctoral dissertation, is I look at the physical properties of the ice. So most of you probably know ice cores. People are interested in ice cores because they can tell us about the history of greenhouse gases. That's sort of the hot topic. Everybody wants to know what carbon dioxide did, what methane did. But what I'm actually interested in is what the ice itself did. How did it move? How did it deform? How did it flow? What's the history of the ice sheet? When did it grow? When did it shrink? So what I do is I take very small pieces of the ice core and I shave them down, and I look at number of bubbles in the core, how those bubbles are arranged, how are they squished, how are they oriented. I take samples of ice and I put them under polarized film so that you can actually see each of the individual crystals of ice. So each one of these colored shapes is a single crystal. And all these boundaries that connect the crystals, they tell us something about how the ice deformed. The colors are telling us which way the crystals are oriented. All gives us information about what the ice has done. So that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. I'm actually interested in the physical properties, the geology of the ice, so to speak. So as you can imagine, though, when I'm sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table, or when I'm out talking with friends, or even if it's just somebody I've met at Starbucks in line, when I start to talk about ice cores or what it is that I do, before I can even finish what I'm saying, the first question I'm always asked is global warming real? That's what everybody wants to know. Everybody always wants to know that before I can even explain what I look at, that I don't even look at greenhouse gases, I look at ice. And we could certainly spend 3 hours talking about all the evidence for global climate change, and we could talk about all the different ice cores and all the different sediment cores and cave stalactites and tree rings and everything. We could talk about it all day. But what I found is that when I talk to people, I actually come from an engineering background, actually. I was going to say this at the beginning. I grew up outside of Rochester, and I went to college to study engineering. So I have I had to come into this field with a very different mindset from most scientists. For me, you have a problem, you engineer a solution, you solve it, it just works. So when I decided to go back to school for science, I had to sort of learn that it's a lot different in science. You have to pose hypotheses and testable hypotheses. You have to come up with experiments. You have to make predictions. It's a very different sort of mentality, and it was very hard for me to understand how, coming from an engineering background, you can have an experiment or evidence, and yet a lot of times it's still not accepted. So that was something that communicating science is actually a very interesting field within itself, and it takes a lot of finesse, and it's something that I've had to learn. So I find that when I talk to people about what it is I do and all the things that I've learned in paleoclimatology, glaciology, all the international meetings I've been to, all the thousands of papers and peer-reviewed literature that I've read, part of me gets really excited because I love knowing that people are interested in what I do. I love knowing that this topic has made it into sort of the public discourse. That's really cool. But there's that small part of me that also gets a little frustrated when I talk about all these great things and people have already made up their mind that basically I'm wasting all my time and it's all nonsense. So this is something that I'm learning and I'm trying to understand and get through. Now, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this topic, so to speak, today. I'm actually going to talk more about what we did at this camp, why we drilled this ice core, some of the cool things we're learning from it. So it's going to be very specific to that. I'm going to keep it more general, so not a lot of science slides, more of what was life like at camp, how did the actual drill work, how do we set up an entire camp at a remote place in West Antarctica. So today, basically my outline is I'm just going to talk about why do we study ice cores, and I'll go a little into the science, like why we care about ice cores, why did we drill at this specific site. Now the site that we went to is called WAIS Divide, and WAIS is an acronym for West Antarctic Ice Sheet. So this place was right up on the middle of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. If you sort of think of Antarctica, I'll show you the map, but in the geoscience community, we sort of break up geographically Antarctica into east and west halves. And so I'm particularly interested in the western half of Antarctica. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence that the western half of Antarctica has done some really interesting and abrupt things in the past. So that's one of the big motivators for this project. The site, what's it like living there? 2 to 3 months out of the year. 5 years in a row I've been down to this camp, and each time I go, you're there for 3 months. You miss all the holidays, you're down there, and you're living in a tent. So it's quite an interesting experience. And then I'll show how do we actually drill it, the engineering involved with making this drill, some of the incredible electronics and computer systems that we had down there. It's just unbelievable. And I'll start talking about some of the things we learned. So we're at the point now where the project just ended, and we're now all starting to analyze the data. So this is the really exciting part for all of the science and the grad students and the researchers. All right, so why do we study ice cores? Like I said, most of you probably know that people look at ice cores, right? We want to know sort of what the greenhouse gases did. But one of the reasons that we really like ice cores is because they're really high resolution. There's certainly all these other things that we have. We have tree rings, we have stalactites and caves, we have sediment cores. People drill cores in the bottom of the ocean, and they go back millions of years. You can look at how the climate has changed in millions of years, right? But ice cores, what's so amazing about them is you won't be able to go back as far in time. The oldest ice core that we have right now goes back about 700,000 years. There's a project being proposed now to drill an ice core that might get us back to 1 million. So that sounds like a long time, but in geologic terms, 1 million years is actually not that far back. But in those couple 100,000 years that we drill, you can actually look at individual years. So you can look at information about a 10-year period 28,000 years ago. If you want to know exactly what happened, because we see all this evidence of abrupt changes, and you say, I want to know exactly what had happened in that short period of time, ice cores are the way to get that information. It's just amazing the amount of resolution that you can get in an ice core. And also that information is almost never interrupted. So as long as it's showing on an ice sheet in places like Antarctica and Greenland where it always snows, you're always going to have a layer from every year. So you have information that you can pull out in all years. And these are just some pictures of places we've drilled all around Antarctica. Each one of those dots is a place we've drilled an ice core. All up in Greenland, all those places are places we've drilled an ice core. And not just us, it's international. So some of those were drilled by Russians and Danes, and it's international projects all over the world. So some of the things we get from ice cores, obviously we get temperatures, we get greenhouse gases, we get all the gases trapped in the bubbles. But we also get history of accumulation. We get volcanic eruptions that you can see ash layers in the core. You can look at various isotopes in the core and actually back out what the sun cycles were doing, what the sunspots were doing. You can look at how the ice sheet moved and formed, which is, like I said, what I'm interested in. So there's all this wealth of information in an ice core, not just greenhouse gases. All right. So obviously we know that climate is sort of the big motivator. That's the big reason we all want to study ice cores. But, or that sort of the general public wants us to study ice cores. Why NSF funds us to study ice cores is because we want to learn about the climate. And we know things like, obviously greenhouse gases matter, right? We know that climate matters. We also know that climate can change abruptly. There's all these instances in the past where climate was kind of moving along, doing its thing, and then there was a huge jump or a huge drop. And we're trying to understand why those things happen naturally in the past so that we can make models and see what they'll do in the future, and then try to factor in the human component and all these things. And we know climate matters, right? You look at like when the Vikings, 1,000 years ago, the Vikings settled in Greenland, and it was warm, because it was during the medieval warm period. It was actually several degrees warmer than it is today, right? In the medieval period. But then, a few hundred years later, it got really cold during what we call the Little Ice Age. A few hundred years ago, there was this short period of time where it got really cold. The Dust Bowl decade in the Plain States, you know, some climate matters. It matters to people like all the cliff-dwelling people out west, right? They settled in settlements for hundreds of years in the cliffs. And then all of a sudden, just like that, they vanished. And the leading hypothesis is that because the climate changed, and they couldn't grow crops, they couldn't survive. But one of the other really big stories that a lot of people forget about ice cores and about what matters is sea level. Sea level is a big deal because if you take all the ice in Greenland and all the ice in Antarctica and you melt it, sea level goes up over 200 feet. I mean, that's almost the entire state of Florida. The highest point of Florida is like 300 feet. So if something were to happen to one of these ice sheets catastrophically and we actually lost a lot of the mass, we would have a significant sea level rise. So that's one of the big things that a lot of people are looking at too, is what happens when all this ice starts to melt? What happens to these coastal countries like Bangladesh and these island nations and the coasts of Florida and all these things like that? So the particular area that I work in West Antarctica, if West Antarctica were to go, sea level would rise about 6 to 7 meters, so over 20 feet. All right, so this is one of the data graphs I'm going to show today. But basically what you're looking at, I'll try and keep it really simple here, is you're looking at 100,000 years have passed. So this is today over here, that's 100,000 years ago over there. And all of this in here is the last ice age. So what we're living in today, the last 10,000 years, is kind of this comfortable period we call the Holocene. It's sort of moderate temperatures, a warm period, an interglacial we call it, so we're in this nice warm period here. All of this was the last ice age. It lasted for about 100,000 years. But what you immediately see is, if this is all supposed to be cold, what are all these super fast spikes in here? Each one of these numbered spikes was a period of time during the ice age where abruptly it got really warm and then it got really cold. Really warm and really cold. So you have all this evidence of these events where, just like that, something happened and the temperature went up significantly and then immediately dropped. And then even when we were coming out of the ice age about 15,000 years ago, it started to get warm at the end and then it dropped down and got really cold during this event here that hundreds of people have studied this event, Younger Dryas event it's called. And then it got warm and now we've sort of been cruising along up here where it's sort of stable and warm for the past 10,000 years. Of course, not including the past few hundred years, which would be way off the chart. But so that, and another thing you notice is that this is data from the northern hemisphere, and this is data from the southern hemisphere. This is down in Antarctica, this is up in Greenland. And you notice that they're not quite the same. Like sometimes a peak happens here, and they're a little bit offset, and that's another big motivator. People want to understand why there's this sort of seesaw effect. Sometimes climate changes in the northern hemisphere, but it takes a while for it to react in the southern hemisphere. Now, if you take this and you expand it even further back, so now you're looking at 400,000 years, and sorry, the axes have flipped. That's actually today now. You'll notice that it repeats, right? So we have this like warm period today, and then we have this cold glacial, and then there was a warm period about 115,000 years ago, and then another glacial, and then another warm, and so this pattern repeats. We see it. We understand why this happens. We understand that the way the Earth is tilted at the sun, the changes in the orbits. A lot of people have studied this. We understand it. But, make sure. I have a video next, and this is what actually got people really interested in West Antarctica. If you take this data and you plug it into an elevation model, an ice sheet model, we know how ice sheets move, we know how ice deforms, and you look at what the ice sheet in West Antarctica has done over the past 400,000 years. This is what you get. Now you'll watch this, you'll see the ice sheet grows kind of slowly and then it shrinks really fast. There's these abrupt changes in the amount of ice in Antarctica. And that's what scares scientists, because if something like that were to happen, you lose all that ice, you gain all that sea level, and it can be pretty... Hey, all right. So this is Antarctica, and you can see this is how many years ago. So it's progressing in 1,000-year increments. But you can see how it grows kind of slowly. And then there's actually one period here where the whole West Antarctic ice sheet goes away. Watch. And it's going, and there it goes. It disappeared. So the whole ice sheet just disappeared, just like that, in less than 1,000 years. And so this can actually happen. This has happened in the past. This is what Antarctica has done. It's grown, it's shrunk, it's grown, it's shrunk. And so we know it happens, and it's even more scary now when you think about the extra component that we're sort of pushing it with the extra greenhouse gases that we're. This is another sort of news slide. This is just showing people have already started to look at what's happening today, and the area of West Antarctica, which is over here. I was talking about East Antarctica and West Antarctica. All the evidence shows that West Antarctica is the fastest moving, has the fastest moving ice streams, so these glaciers, these outlet glaciers of the ice sheet, fastest moving anywhere in the world. So the West Antarctic ice sheet is collapsing quite fast, actually, right now. And a lot of people are studying this, and it's very alarming that you look at all of Antarctica, and the one place that's big and red, that's losing a lot of mass, is where we studied our ice core. So, all right, I'm going to go into just a little bit about why ice cores work, and then I'll show you the field site stuff. So, the reason that ice cores can track data is simply because it snows there. It snows every year. Every year it snows, it's cold there, it never melts. So every year that snow just keeps piling on top every year. And as it piles on top, the snow from the year before gets buried further and further and further. And then eventually what happens is that snow that fell 50 years ago is now down here, and then 70 years ago it's down here, and eventually all those little air pockets in between all the snowflakes and crystals get squished and close off and form these bubbles. And so it's in those bubbles that the air gets trapped forever until you pull it out of the ground and melt it. And so in that respect, you're able to look at the concentration of the atmosphere thousands of years ago in these little bubbles. And this depth, where that happens, is not far down. It's only about 75 meters down in the snow, so 200 feet or so. And you get a little bit of offset, so the air is still able to kind of work its way up and down. So usually there's an offset of a couple hundred years between the ice and the air that's in the ice. But people also look at the ice itself, not just the bubbles. So if you look and you analyze the ice, you learn things about what's happening there as well as the air that's in the bubbles. And the reason that we drill where we drill, I was talking about the site called Waste Divide, it's up on a divide. So if this is a huge ice sheet, kind of think of it as a giant pile of snow. Where we drilled was right in the middle at the top. And the reason we drilled right there is because if you kind of look at the way the arrows are moving, an ice sheet is just a big pile, a big glob of maple syrup, and when you pour it, it just kind of wants to ooze out the sides. But if you go right to the middle, everything is either moving to the left or to the right, but right at the middle, it's just moving down. And so you're not getting any like deformation to the left or right, you're just kind of getting squished, and that's the perfect place to drill an ice core, because the record is nice and horizontal, and you don't get any weird motion of the ice. It just comes straight down. And so that's why we picked what we picked in West Antarctica, because it's right on the top of the ice sheet. So, here's a map of Antarctica. This is where we were, right there up on the top of the divide in West Antarctica. This is McMurdo Station. That's the main sort of hive of Antarctica where the U.S. program operates out of. So why did we go there? I just talked about some of the reasons. But one of the big reasons is because it snows a lot there. As much as you might have heard that it's a desert in Antarctica, it never snows in Antarctica, there are places in Antarctica where it actually snows a lot, and West Antarctica is one of those places. It snows about 2.5 feet a year, which, again, doesn't sound like a lot if you live in Ithaca, but it's actually a lot in Antarctica. So 2.5 feet a year means every year you have that much snow that gets preserved from that year. So as it gets buried, that means you can go back up to 40,000 years and still pull out a single layer of time. Even though it's getting squished, at the bottom, that layer is still a centimeter thick, so you can still pull out a single year's worth of time. Another reason that we drilled at this site was because there's a core that we drilled up in the northern hemisphere in Greenland at a very specific place, and the conditions at this site are exactly the same as the conditions at the site up in Greenland. And so we wanted a core that was a sister core to that core in Greenland so that we could look at what happened in the northern hemisphere and what happened in the southern hemisphere at two sites that are basically the same to see how they change, either offset each other or change at the same time, that seesaw effect I was talking about. Again, it's on a divide, so you don't have any of that weird ice flow stuff to worry about. It's very well behaved. And we were hoping, when we proposed this project, that the ice at the bottom would be 120,000 years old. Based on some radar layers that we took at the site, what we know about the site, we know that the ice was 3,400 meters thick there. We were hoping that the bottom would be 120,000 years. And the reason why that number is so important is because 120,000 years actually brings us back to that last warm period. And we're really interested in what happened during the last warm period as it compares to today. But, as it turns out, we didn't get that far back, and I'll explain why we didn't in a little bit. All right, so when we wrote our proposal, our primary objective was to obviously get a very detailed greenhouse record, to determine the climate changes, again, that north and south seesaw interest that a lot of people have. We wanted to look at the stability of the ice sheet. There were all sorts of proposals. There were 40 universities involved, 20 labs, there were 1,000 researchers. People put in proposals to study everything you can imagine in this ice core, every sort of chemistry indicator, every sort of gas. I mean, it was one of the largest ice core projects ever in the history of the world. But there's even people that are looking at biology. There are people who want to know that if there's microbes in the ice, if there's these extremophile bacteria that can live deep within the ice sheet. So it's just fascinating. People are studying everything about this ice core. And that's just a picture of one of the cores after it came up. All right. So life at Waste Divide. This, again, is our field site. It's about a 5-hour flight from the main station. And it was pretty, even though it looks kind of remote and crazy, we were quite spoiled. We had some pretty luxury. Each one of these buildings is heated, and even though it's Antarctica, it's actually really warm in the summer there. The average temperature was about 0 F, so a cold day in the winter here. It really wasn't that bad. And you have so many clothes, so many warm parkas and stuff that you wear. It's really not that bad. It's quite comfortable. And basically, this was our setup. Like I said, we had a galley, we had a recreation tent where we could just relax and read, things like that. And we had a medic that was there all the time, just in case somebody got hurt. We had a lot of people that operated the heavy machines to lift the cargo, and all of this stuff out here. This is all of our cargo, our science cargo, our food. We had to all the waste had to be transported out. So we had to, anytime we used anything or any leftover food, had to be taken off site. There's an Antarctic treaty in effect that you're not allowed to leave anything at the site, so we had to take everything out. And then those are our tents, like I said, that we lived in. We actually slept in our own little tents. This is just a close-up, walking into camp. These are those buildings. Pretty nice, just average buildings. They're heated. We had a communications tent there where they had a giant satellite dish. We actually had working email at our site, which is amazing. We had a shower that we had that worked. So it was pretty spoiled. This is the tent city, what we call it, where we actually slept. That's my tent right there that I lived in at night. Slept in a sleeping bag right on the ground. And that's the typical field camp. So we had about 40 people, and that included all the drillers, the science team, which is what I was a member of. And then we had all the staff. So we had a cook, we had cargo, we had fuel people, operators, medic, all these people that you need in a small camp. So that's my tent, my home. And inside it was very comfortable. This is the galley. This is where we ate. And we had tables. It was heated. We have our hot coffee in there and play cards, and it was very nice. And we had our cook, and here he is cooking us dinner. And there's one thing people they don't realize is that we don't obviously have plumbing, so every drop of water that we drank, that we cooked with, that we brushed our teeth with, we had to shovel snow and pour it into a melter. So at least twice a day, you were shoveling a bucket full of snow, and it was just, you always did it. Everyone had to do it. Everyone had to shovel 2 buckets of snow a day. It was just how it went. So a lot of snow melting. And what's nice, though, is the snow is so pure that you don't even have to purify it. It's just the cleanest water in the world. It was amazing. All right, so I'm just going to talk really quickly about how you get there, because this is another thing that people don't realize, is you basically spend 2 days on planes. I usually flew out of Rochester, actually, because my family still lives there, and I would fly from Rochester, Chicago to LA, typical sort of cross-country. And then from LA, you get on a plane for 12 hours and go to New Zealand. And then you go to the South Island of New Zealand, and then you fly down to the main station on a C-17, which is a giant military cargo plane up on the top there. And then you hop on a plane. Once you get down to the McMurdo station, you have to spend a day there doing some training and some, you have to do a bunch of communication training for radios, and you have to go through what we call snow school, which is where you learn how to survive just in case something happens. And then you get on a ski-equipped LC-130 military cargo plane, and you fly that out. So you sit in a little seat on the side with little straps, and it's quite an interesting experience. And right in the middle, you have all your cargo. Everything that comes in and out of camp comes in on that plane. And that was about a 4-hour flight. And this is just a little, I made this little animation of how long it takes to get there. To Los Angeles, all the way down to Auckland, New Zealand, down to Christchurch, New Zealand, down to McMurdo, and then way out to Waste Divide. So it was a lot of time to plane. And then once you're there, you basically, everywhere you get around is mostly on foot. We do have snowmobiles, and so we would drive back and forth to work in that arch. We would usually hop on the back of a sled, and someone would tow us out there, so it was much quicker. We also had some machines like the tucker there to sort of push snow around. Anytime you're at a place where it snows a lot and it's windy, you get drifting everywhere. So all the buildings were constantly drifting and getting really weird piles that would form around tents and stuff. So they were always pushing snow around, always trying to clean out the drifts. A typical field season was about 2.5 months. We would deploy in mid-November, come back early February. But in that time, we only actually drilled for about 45 days. And that's because it takes a couple weeks to set up and a couple weeks to tear down. And so you're talking about a very narrow window of time that you really have no room for mistakes. And in that time, we were working usually 6 days a week, 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 8-hour shifts. And sometimes we would work 7 days a week if something happened and we got behind. And sometimes we would work 12-hour shifts too. So it was very long and tiring days, and not a lot of time to really relax. You're constantly working. And of course, you miss Christmas, you miss Thanksgiving, you miss New Year's, you miss birthdays, you miss all sorts of stuff. And so we had to make do. We had a little Christmas dinner that we set up ourselves, and everyone exchanged goofy gifts for each other. And you know, that's just what you did, and it was fun. It was like a whole family down there. Everybody gets to know each other really well, and it's actually quite a good time. And we did squeeze in some fun. We built igloos, we flew some kites, and we took ice core tubes and made little miniature golf courses out of them. We had little contests who could build the largest towers out of snow blocks and goofy things like that. You just find ways to have fun. I put this picture here just to show you just how much it snows and drifts. First season, this was the drilling arch. You're talking about 20 feet high on the front, maybe 35 to 40 feet high on the back. And just in the 5 years that we were there drilling, by the last season when we opened camp, the entire building was covered under the ground. Completely buried. You can see it got worse every year. But you know, this is the opening of the season before. So every year we go down, we have to get this big caterpillar and push out the door and like make room because we had to pull all of our cargo out that front door. And so if it was blocked by snow and you couldn't even get in it, you had no like safety exits or any of that stuff. So we were constantly shoveling. I think that's me actually right there, shoveling. Always shoveling. You're always just hauling snow all the time. This is a typical condition 2 storm. You can kind of see the video. It's sort of hard. That's kind of hard to see, but you can't even see like maybe, I don't know, 1,800 feet in front of you, and that's a condition 2 storm. We actually have a situation called condition 1 where if you put your hand out here, you can't see it. And when that happens, you're not allowed to leave your building. You have to stay in the building because as soon as you walk out, you could just walk and never find your way back. It's very dangerous. That's just the back of the arch. That was the 40-foot side, and you can see it's almost completely buried. Thankfully, the project is over now, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. All right, so a little bit about the drilling. This is the actual drill barrel here that drills the cores. You can't really see, but there are 4 cutters around the edge. And the general idea is that basically this barrel goes down into a hole in the ice, and it spins just like a drill bit, and it cuts out a core and then pulls it up. And the way that it pulls it up is these little clips inside the barrel that stay pushed in, And when you pull up on the barrel, they lock into the side of the core and help pull it up. We call them the core dogs, and these little things that bite into the side of the core. The core diameter, I can tell you it's 12.2 centimeters, but that doesn't really mean anything. It was the exact diameter of a CD-ROM. So if you can imagine a CD, that's exactly how big the core was. Everything that we ran was controlled by computers. The way that the drilling arch worked is you have this long drilling barrel on a table, and at the top you had your barrel for the core, but then after that you had all these sections. You had an instrument section, and an electronics section, and a pump, and a motor, and all this information in this barrel that was all electronically controlled. And then what happened when you went to actually drill a core, the whole tower tilted vertically so that the core barrel could be dropped. And that's what's happening right here. You can see the towers tilting up vertically so that we can lower it down into the borehole. Everything that the drillers had the best job ever. They sat in a little warm booth with a bunch of computers and they ran everything with a mouse. They literally drilled an ice core with a mouse and a computer. And all this tells them how fast it's drilling, sort of how much weight is on the drill, how much tension is on the cable, all that stuff they can monitor electronically. Fiber optic communication in the cable itself, so it's very intelligent.
And this top driven or bottom driven?
The motor for the drill is actually up at the top of the drill, so it's up there. I'll show you another picture of it. And then this here is this is the winch with all the cable. We have 4,000 meters of cable. We knew that the cable, the core wouldn't be more than 3,500. That was sort of our estimate. So we had a little extra just in case. And that entire spool was the heaviest thing that we sent to our camp. That one spool was an entire flight. We weighed over 10,000 pounds. Actually 20,000 pounds. Which is the max load of one of those Hercules planes. So this is a picture of the top. You can't really see, but these little plane sections actually have a whole bunch of electronics in them. And then this piece here, these little wings, that's what we call the anti-torque. What happens is the barrel goes down into the hole and it starts spinning. The barrel's going to want to, everything's going to want to spin. So these little things, they push into the side of the hole to kind of keep it stuck so that only the drill at the bottom is spinning. What happens is they go down, they drill a core. Once they pop the core and ready to pull it up, it comes up to the surface. They grab it with this gantry inside the drilling section, and they actually walk it over on this gantry, set it down on a table, and push it up against a wall. And that wall separates the drilling side of the arch from the science side. So as soon as they get up to that wall, they push the core through the barrel the other way, and we receive it on the science side. And that's the side I worked on. That's the side where once it comes through, we start measuring it. We measure how long it is, we measure all the cracks in it, all the fractures. Anything we see in the core, we document it in a database. And so that was sort of my job at the camp, is I was one of these science loggers, these core loggers. My job was to basically document every single thing about the core so that when it came back and we took it out of the tube, we know exactly where it's from, how big it is, all the details about it. And this was our team one particular year. There was about 16 of us total, 8 and 8, so 8 drillers, 8 science crew. I think that's there, maybe. Yes. And then this guy here is actually, he is the primary, he was the head principal investigator for the entire project. He actually came down on a visit this particular year. So he put in the giant proposal for this entire project to happen. So it's kind of neat having him there at camp. And this is a graph showing our progress. So each one of these colors is from a different year. So our first year we drilled that far down, and then we drilled that far, and then that far. So every year we got a little bit better. We drilled more, but you can also see it kind of starts to flatten out a little. And that's because, if you think about it, the farther down you get in the borehole, the longer it takes to go down to the bottom, the longer it takes to come back up to the core. So as you get deeper, each time you drill a core, it takes longer and longer. First season, we were pulling up a core every 30 minutes. By the last season, it was every 2.5 hours. So it's a huge difference. Now, as far as major outages, we had some of the best engineers on the planet, I'm convinced. We had a lot of little problems, a lot of computer glitches, instrument glitches. These electronics aren't made to operate at these temperatures. So a lot of things would burn out or break, and these guys were fixing it in the field, soldering stuff, fixing it right there in the field. And every time we had a problem, it was fixed within a day, with one exception, and that's this picture here. So try to imagine you're playing with a yo-yo, and the yo-yo's hanging down the bottom, and you pick up the yo-yo. What does that string do? That string goes, and it cranks up, right? So what happened was one time we were drilling the core, the core was going down the hole, and it caught the side. And all that tension in the cable immediately relaxed, and the cable kinked up, and that's what happened to it. And that put us down for 10 days. We had to stop drilling for 10 days so they could cut the cable, re-terminate it, and it just so happened that kink happened at the very end, the very top of the cable, so we didn't have to completely cancel the project. We were able to cut it, reattach it, and start over. Like I said, we had 4,000 meters of cable. It happened in that extra buffer, so we were really lucky. But it was very scary. The whole building shook, and it was very. I was in the building when that happened, and it was quite terrifying. All right, so moving on, the core comes through the wall, and this is where I come into play. The core comes out of the tube. We clean it with a rag. We start penciling it, and you can mark on the core. You can pencil on the core. It doesn't damage the integrity. All the samples that people use for their sampling comes from inside the outer edge. So writing on the core doesn't affect any of the measurements with the pencil. So it comes through. We mark it. We mark everything, like I said, we mark fractures, breaks, all that stuff. And we put everything into this database, all the comments, everything. And then we cut it. We actually cut the core into meter-long sections, put them into tubes so they can be shipped home. And the reason that this core has a green color on it is because some of the cores, there's a specific depth when you're drilling where the cores are very brittle, and as soon as you bring them off, they start to want to break. So we actually bought it's wine bottle netting. It actually worked really well. And so when the core would come to the wall, we would push it through this netting to kind of keep it together from breaking. It worked really well. And we only had to do that for one season. Okay, so when it comes up, very few measurements are made in the field. Almost everything happens back in the United States. But there were a couple things we did. One of the things we did was we took a little wood planer and we actually shaved a very small bit of ice off the top of some of the cores at the bottom so that we could analyze that shaving to get an accurate estimate of how old the ice was quickly, because otherwise we have to wait for the whole thing to come back, for 6 months to come back to the United States, get cut up in the labs, and it would take a long time. We wanted to get an estimate really quickly, so we actually took these shavings and measured them right there in the field. Another thing that we did, and this was actually my job one year, was there was this machine that we would scan the cores through, and it would actually scan the electrical properties of the core. And the reason we do that is because you can see the seasonal winters and summer cycles based on the conductivity of the core. During the summer, there's more ions in the snow, and so it's more electrically conductive in the summers than the winters. So you have this beautiful plot. It's just peaks and valleys. Summer, winter, summer, winter. You can count all the way there. It's really fascinating. And then this was an ice core, or an ash layer from a volcano that we saw in an ice core, about a centimeter thick, huge volcano in West Antarctica that erupted about 5,000 years ago, and it was just perfectly preserved in the ice core. Fantastic. And then these samples over here were actually my samples, so my physical property samples. I cut those little wedges, and that's those pictures of those cool crystals and bubbles that I was making out of those samples. And I did that right in the field, and so that the ice wouldn't change by the time we got back. All right, this is just us packing it up, putting it into some boxes, and then here's a little video of it getting loaded onto the plane. Actually, the machine actually picks up the whole pallet of ice cores, puts them on a plane. At one point, we actually figured it out. One plane loaded with 2 pallets of ice cores was probably the most expensive plane on the planet at the time because of how much value is in those ice cores. And of course the flight has to be what's called a cold deck, which means they literally open all the doors when it's on the ground so that the back of the plane gets really cold, and they don't turn the heat on ever. So the plane flies all the way back to McMurdo, minus 25 C. It's really cold. I actually flew on a cold deck once, and it was cold. Okay, so this is a little time lapse of the actual drilling. This is the drill going up, being lowered down into the borehole, spooling off the spool. It comes back up, lays back down on the table. They pick it up, they move it over to the core handling side. Sorry, it's kind of fast. And then this is where we do all of our measurements on it. We're scanning with we actually have a laser measuring device. We can measure it very precisely. We had a light, we were looking at all the cracks. gets moved over to the other side. We're entering a bunch of stuff in the database. And then this is that scanner that goes up and actually scans the core of the electrical properties. And I ran that for 1 year, and you just stand there with a button. Every core goes through with you just freezing in the arch. One of the ironies, the ultimate ironies of working at this field site was the average temperature was, like I said, about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside this building, we actually have air conditioning units running to make it colder. So we're in Antarctica running air conditioners because the ice is very sensitive and it's under all that pressure down below. When you pull it up, it wants to expand and break. But one of the ways to sort of combat that is to keep it really cold. And so we just made it was about minus 30 C inside the arch, so about minus 20. All right. So it was cold, really cold. It was actually colder working than it was outside. Then all the ice comes back to the lab, which is in Denver. We have a huge library of ice cores in Denver, and of course from all the U.S. projects ever drilled. And it comes back, and for a couple months we process it. We take each core, we remeasure it just to make sure everything was right, and then we cut it up. And basically we have cut plans that look like this. Each one of these little blocks goes to a different lab, right? So isotopes, physical properties, chemistry, gases, all the people studying all the different things get a tiny little piece of the ice. But it's important to note, those two pieces called archives, we always save at least one piece from every core. And it gets put in a tube and back in the huge library of ice cores at the ice core lab. Just in case, someday down the line, we discover a very interesting period of time that we want to understand better, we still have a piece of ice from that. And it's really hard to get permission to use that archive. You have to have a really good reason to get that archive. This is again running that scanner for the properties, and this is one of my colleagues. She's actually making more of those thin sections of all those crystal orientations. You can kind of see that. That's one of the labs that I work in. This is another lab where they're actually melting the core so they can analyze the air that's inside it. And this machine down here is one that I got to work on at Penn State, which is each one of these little vessels. You put a piece of ice in, you seal it up, you suck out all the air, and then you melt ice, and whatever air comes out of the melted ice, then you can measure it. So that's a way to measure. In this case, we were measuring the methane concentration. All right. So, what are we doing? Okay, we're almost done. As far as what we've been learning so far, this core, like I said, we've only just started to actually analyze our data, and so far it's been really exciting. We've just had a few papers come out in Nature and Science, and we've got a lot of really good publicity. Like this project has made quite a stir in the international community. We now have the highest resolution core ever retrieved from Antarctica, ever, and it's the second deepest ice core ever drilled, second only to the Vostok core, which is drilled by the Russians, which is also much lower resolution though. We only were able to get about 60,000 years of time though, not the 100 that we were hoping. And the reason is actually quite fascinating. It turns out that underneath the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, it's really warm, and we did not anticipate this. There is the equivalent of a Yellowstone National Park underneath the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And so what's happening is it's so warm down there, it's actually melting the ice from underneath. And so all those really old layers are melting from underneath. And so we looked at the thickness of the ice sheet, and we said, okay, based on how much it snows, this is how old the ice should be at the bottom. And it's not. It's much younger. So while we still have an amazing record, and we got 60,000 years of time, and annual resolution, single years back to 40,000 years, we were not able to get ice from that previous warm period. But this is just this is just showing you, this is a temperature reconstruction using isotopes, and just kind of shows you how high a resolution, and this is actually a low resolution. This is 100-year averages, I think. So you can see this was the Ice Age, it came up, and then there was that weird cold period right before, and then we're kind of cruising along up here to present day. One other thing that we learned is that we can see the most recent warming. So this is measurements from people measure the temperature down in the borehole after we drilled the core, and we can see these are all the different modeled temperature histories from the year 200 to the year 2000. And you can see you have sort of the medieval warm period up in here, and then you have this little mini ice age, the little ice age we call it, and then right here again, there's this 1.5 degree increase in sort of the past since 1957. You can see it in the data. It's actually quite amazing. And the other thing that we've seen is that West Antarctica this was from a paper that came out in Science, actually, that all of West Antarctica is very sensitive to climate change. So East Antarctica kind of is very stable, right? But West Antarctica is very sensitive. When you think back to that animation of how fast West Antarctica collapsed, that's kind of scary when you see that. This was some of the CO2 measurements from the core. So you can see, I mean, this is what we see in all the data, right? You see that CO2 kind of goes along, does its thing, and then there's today, right? And that's not even today. That's actually only up to something like 1920. And I think if you add, I have a plot here, if you add the recent measurements from Hawaii, it goes up even further, right? So I mean, that's, everybody knows that. Everybody knows CO2 is off the charts. We just hit 400 parts per million for the first time in recent history, which is right, that's scary.
May 11th last year.
Huh?
May 11th last
May
year.
11th, there we go. So, one of the other things that we found, like we've been seeing some really fascinating things. So this is a record of accumulation. These are all different ways that we were able to kind of back out how much it snowed. So these are just different models of how much it snowed. But you notice in all these models, something happened right there that's really strange. All of a sudden, over a very short 100-year period, it snowed a lot more than it had any time before or any time after. It just, the accumulation went way up, and then it came right back down again. And we don't know why. That's very, it's something we just don't quite understand yet. Why did it do that? The temperature was just kind of cruising along. It wasn't because it got warmer and more moisture was in the air. Temperature was just kind of doing its thing, and yet all of a sudden, accumulation just spiked. Very strange. So stuff like that gets people like me really excited. So that means I get something to study. That's really good. You know? All right, so I think this is my last one. Looking ahead, the Waste to Buy project was the most successful project ever done by the U.S. drilling program. He said everything about this project was a huge success. It took 6 years. The original idea for this project initiated in 1987. And so when I was there in the field and I logged that last core, I looked up at the person I was working with and said, wow, that was 25 years just ended right now. And it was really a profound moment. I said, wow, 25 years ago, some guy in a meeting said, we should drill an ice core in West Antarctica. And 25 years later, we were logging the last core. So it was really cool. We were able to drill 3,405 meters, over 2 miles of ice, which is why the talk was 2 miles of ice. Several graduate students like myself, I mean, I'm getting my doctorate in this, so it's very exciting for me that I got to study this for 6 years. A lot of my collaborators were all grad students. It was really, really awesome to see so many students involved in this project. A lot of people started their careers in this project, including myself. The core there's an amazing amount of data that we're still analyzing from it. I mean, you can read the rest. We're just now finally starting to look at all the amazing stuff. Papers are starting to come out. We're starting to get published. So it's an exciting time for those of us that are working on this project. And a little teaser for what's next. We're actually putting in a proposal this year to drill another core at South Pole itself. So we're actually at the South Pole drilling the core. And the project itself has just been funded, but all of our individual science projects have not yet. So, but we will be drilling an ice core starting this winter at South Pole. So it's really exciting, and there's a lot of things that are very different at South Pole that were at Waste to Buy, including how the ice moves there. So I'm really interested in the physical properties at South Pole, because ice isn't on a divide there. Ice is moving, it's deforming, it's doing all sorts of neat stuff. So yeah, that's sort of what's next, and hopefully that'll be enough. So. All right, snowball questions.
Do you ever hit fossil material or trees?
No, we never hit anything like that. The only thing that we ever hit that was obvious in the ice cores was the ash layers. And that one that I showed you was actually kind of an exception. We saw maybe 3 or 4 that were that clear, dark, that actually had tephra, that actually had physical particles in it. There were a lot of layers that we saw in the core that were very faint, and you kind of had to tilt your eyes back and forth, and they were just sort of cloudy. And it turns out there's actually a whole team, a group that just looks at volcanoes in West Antarctica. And they're in on this project as well, and they've been analyzing the chemistry of every single one of those volcanic layers and tying it back to which volcano it's from. And it turns out that one of the volcanoes in the area put out really dark, nasty ash, and all the rest just sort of put out this very faint dust. And all those layers that we saw were from those other volcanoes, with the exception of those couple that were really thick, dark ones. And that's actually one of the only places in the core, too, where we have evidence that there was melt, because that ash layer sat on the surface that actually caused the layer right below it to melt a little bit. Until recently, that's a very important point, is that in the entire record of the ice core, there's not a single melt layer, except for 2 years ago. And that's not in the core, it was on the surface. I actually dug snow pits in the surface, and in 2000, I guess it was 3 years ago, 2011 season, I found a melt layer in the snow pit, which means for the first time in 60,000 years, there was evidence of melt at this site. So that's kind of crazy.
You said that maybe earlier in the presentation you said that people were researching to see if there were any sort of life, like bacteria.
Yeah.
Did you
I didn't look at that stuff, but I do know the two particular individuals that are studying that, they did find evidence of, I'm not sure if it was bacteria or if they were looking at very specific markers for life, but I know that they did find evidence of very small critters of some kind, whether it was bacteria or protozoan or something, but only in the shallow parts of the core. And I'm not sure if that's because, I'm actually not sure why it is. I don't know much about that, but I do know that they did find evidence for some single-cell organisms in the core.
How do the thickness of these annual layers change through that period of time?
Right, so I mean, obviously, that ice sheet is squishing down and flowing. You have thinning going on. So at the top, at the surface, a layer is, like I said, about 2.5 feet. And because it's on a dividing, you don't really have to worry about ice coming in from somewhere else or ice moving out to somewhere else. There's actually very basic flow laws and thinning laws where you can just plug it into the equation and figure out, as you go down deeper, how thick the layer. And the glib answer is that at the bottom, that an annual layer was about 1 centimeter thick. So if you can think at the bottom it was 1 centimeter, and at the top it was, I keep saying feet and centimeters. I'm trying to remember, I should just keep it in feet. But at the top it was about 2.5 feet. It's about 60 to 70 centimeters. So I mean, you're shrinking down over an order of magnitude. So you're going from 70 centimeters down to 1 centimeter, almost 2 orders.
You see tree pollens as you go?
Tree ponds, I'm not sure. We definitely see a lot of dust. So one of my good friends working on this project, she's been mapping all the dust sources that we find in the core. So you take a core, you look at it, it looks perfectly clear, but when you analyze it, there's actually a lot of very small dust particulates. And she's been able to identify places in New Zealand, Australia, South America that have all brought dust down to this particular site. So by doing that, I think her end goal is to try and figure out sort of how the atmospheric patterns have changed in the southern hemisphere. I'm not sure about pollens, though. That's something I'm not sure about that. I would imagine it's in the dust. Yeah.
The Ice Age cycle is somewhere around 25,000 years here in the northern hemisphere.
Well,
is
it's...
there any indication of that in your ice cores?
So the Ice Age cycle, at least in the last 700,000 years or so, has been actually about every 100,000 years. So that, if I don't know if I'm going to hold it back here, but like I said, the last Ice Age was from about 10,000 years ago to about 110,000 years ago. So they last about 100,000 years. And then you have this very short period of time where it's actually sort of warm. And that's one of the things that's quite unique about the time period we live in today, right? Is that a lot of these past warm periods were very short, and the one we're in today has been kind of warm for a while. So it seems that a lot of people are studying, why are we so stable? Have we been so stable for the past 10,000 years? So the Ice Age cycles, something of this magnitude is governed by how much energy we get from the sun is basically the short answer. So we know that there's these cycles, that the Earth wobbles in a certain way, the axis of the Earth changes in ways, and the orbits of the Earth change. And you put all those things together, and that's what drives these Ice Age cycles, right? So the Earth is tilted a little bit more towards the sun, or it's wobbled a little bit further away from the sun, there's these cycles that are called Milankovitch cycles. So every 100,000 years, we're in a position where we're getting more energy from the sun, and that's why we have a warm period, which is sort of what we're in today. And then it tilts away, or the orbit's a little bit further, and that's when you get the ice ages. And it's actually interesting because all these different cycles are slightly offset. One has a 40,000-year cycle, and one has a 100,000-year cycle. But you put them all together, and they kind of all average out to 100,000 years. At least for the past 700,000 years. And then before that, the cycle actually was much shorter. And so we still don't fully understand why that shifted. I mean, there's people have dedicated their whole careers to trying to understand that. And then you go back even further than that, before the ice ages a couple million years ago, and things were totally different. So this is an interesting time to live in, to study ice ages, actually. It's very fascinating. Somebody else?
Another question with that.
Yeah.
When did you stop drilling? How far were you from the
That's a great one.
base? And also, what was it hitting water or just?
Yeah, so here, okay, so that's actually a really great question. Because of the Antarctic Treaty, we had certain rules we had to follow. And when we worked with NSF and we decided, there were a lot of people that wanted to drill to the bed. We want to get to the bottom and see what's at the bottom. Maybe we can change the head on it and actually drill some of the rock at the bottom or something. The problem is that we had sort of guessed that the bottom was going to be water, and it turned out it was, so there was a melting. And you have to use a drill fluid in the hole, and we were worried that if we punched through the bottom, all that drill fluid would shoot out into the bottom and would contaminate, because the drill fluid is basically kerosene. So it's not environmentally friendly. If it spilled out in the bottom, you're basically contaminating underneath the ice sheet. And because of the treaty and because of our stewardship, in Antarctica, we had to be very careful. And we were told from NSF that we had to leave at least a 50-meter buffer above the bottom. So we did a bunch of radar soundings right there at the site, and we figured exactly how far it was to the bottom. We also did seismic experiments, so we set up a bunch of sensors on the surface and actually exploded a little explosive pocket on the surface, and it sent down a signal and back up and said, the depth of the bottom is 3,500 meters. And so we drilled a 3405, basically. And we still don't know exactly, specifically how deep it is. It's plus or minus maybe 10 meters, but we didn't want to risk it by going any further. And so we stopped at 3400.
Didn't the Russians actually penetrate it?
They did, yeah. And so the Russians aren't necessarily as good about following the treaty, we'll say. Their ice core, the Vostok core, is over a lake, which is a very interesting, unique situation. And they had this entire theory about what they could do is they wanted to drill down into the lake because this lake is several million years old and want to see what kind of life is involved in this lake. And so they said, if we drill down into the lake, they hypothesized that the pressure in the lake is greater than the pressure in the borehole, so that as soon as they punch through, instead of the fluid going down into the lake water would come up into the hole and refreeze, and then they could go back down and drill that frozen lake water. And it didn't quite work out that way. So they actually did contaminate the lake to some extent. And yeah, I don't really know a lot of the inner details of what happened there, but I've watched videos of that project, and it's very different than how we run the project. So, but they did punch through, and that's actually the core. That's the one core that's deeper than our core. That's the 4,000 core.
Okay, this slide shows it pretty well. That these glacial cycles, the long ones are very asymmetric. They heat up really fast and then cool down. And the individual events are also quite asymmetric. They cool down irregularly and slowly, and they heat up rapidly. Okay, this is the slide I say. But in Antarctica, you don't seem to see that asymmetry, and if so, the asymmetry would be opposite.
The northern hemisphere is much more sensitive to climate change than the southern. That's what we see, and certainly I could go into all the stuff that you already know about, like the Heinrich events and all these things that happen in the northern hemisphere. But the southern hemisphere is much more buffered, and the range of changes is a lot smaller than what we see in the northern hemisphere. So
but okay, it's sort of positive feedback maybe that causes the rapid warming at one of these DO cycles. But it really does look like you warm slowly and cool quickly in Antarctica. At least that's what those events, those A events, look like to me.
Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's just what we see. There's a lot of science behind it. There's certainly all the global circulation in the oceans. There's the huge circumpolar deep water that rotates around Antarctica, and there's all sorts of interesting things that happen underneath the ice shelves, warm water coming up and infiltrating the ice shelves, which then when they collapse, it causes the ice sheets. But as far as the temperature reconstructions, one of the things that's very fascinating is you look at records from different ice cores, and you look at the East Antarctic cores and the West Antarctic cores, even just on the continent, very different. And so many things are influencing. Like I said, when you look at just that east versus west, that mountain range that separates the two, so much of West Antarctica is influenced by the marine influence, the storms coming in off the ocean, but so much of East Antarctica is just there and stable. It doesn't snow a lot, you don't get a lot of storms. Even when the world is warming, East Antarctica is one of the few places where the temperature hasn't gone up very much. It's just so stable. But West Antarctica has warmed to a degree or a degree and a half in the last 50 years. So it's really amazing, fascinating how different Antarctica is, just in itself, not even compared to Greenland. So, but anyway.
But the younger Dryas seems to show up down
It does, right. And so some things we see in the northern hemisphere we don't see in the southern hemisphere, but that was like the Little Ice Age. There was a lot of people that said we wouldn't be able to see evidence of the Little Ice Age in Antarctica because it was clearly a northern hemisphere event. Yet when we looked at the temperatures from the warmer line, we could actually see it, and that's not good published. I mean, that's an actual thing we can measure in Antarctica. So it's just interesting how some things you can see in both, some things you can't, some things are offset in both, and that's why that's become a huge question in our community, is this whole talking back and forth between the two hemispheres. Everyone just sort of assumes that what happens globally, and that's not what happens.
I think there was one more question in the
Yeah,
front, and then maybe we
should
can wrap up
probably wrap it
individually.
up.
Yeah.
My question was, the climate change has been pretty drastic in the recent history,
Certainly the evidence, yeah.
but I think that humans should make an effort to do something about it.
I agree.
But to some extent, do you think that this could also be simply the Earth going through a
One of its
warm
cycles?
period?
I think that as a scientific community, we actually understand pretty well all the natural forces that happen. I mean, there are thousands of people around the world that study everything you can imagine that's forcing sea ice interactions and solar cycles and sunspots. I mean, everybody studies all of these things really well. And I think that with what we know about forcings that exist today, and what we know about greenhouse gases and everything that we've studied in the past, we cannot explain what we see in the past several hundred years unless you also include a human being. I think that's the answer. And I mean, that's the answer the IPCC basically has put forth. And it's amazing, because like I said, I come from an engineering background, so when I came into this field, it was like, when I was swarmed with all these papers and all this information, it was amazing to realize just how many thousands of people work on this stuff. It's not just like 50 people decided to publish about climate change. I mean, this is thousands of scientists all over the world are all in agreement on this. This is not something in our community that we even talk about. It's like, oh yeah, that's obviously happening. But when you come out into more of a public forum, it's not that way. And that's one of the things that it comes back to. You have to make sure you're communicating your science well.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.